So we are going to be taking what we learned about independent and dependent clauses and applying that to looking at different types of sentences that use those types of clauses. So sometimes with simple sentences, we might think that a simple sentence is a short sentence, but that's not necessarily the case. The most important thing to remember about simple sentences is that they express one complete thought. So let's take a look at some of the examples here. And I have highlighted in different colors our subject and our complete predicate. So if we take a look at it, in blue we have the cat, and our predicate in green crept through the dark house. So even though this is kind of a lengthier sentence, it is still a simple sentence because it expresses one complete thought. Same thing with our next example. The wary mouse watched from underneath an upturned cereal box. It is one independent clause and it expresses one complete thought. And you can take a look at the other examples of simple sentences on your own. The next type of sentence that we're going to look at is called a compound sentence. A compound sentence contains two independent clauses. So that means it contains two complete sentences. And these sentences, or two independent clauses, are combined by a comma and a conjunction. They can also be combined by using a semicolon as well. So again, our compound sentence contains two independent clauses, and those two independent clauses are going to be combined by using a comma and a conjunction or a semicolon to join these two clauses together. So here we have some examples of compound sentences. You will see in blue our first independent clause. You will see in green the second independent clause. And then in red, you will see how the sentences are combined together. So we have the cat was unsuccessful in his attempt to catch the mouse, and the mouse was equally as unlucky as in his attempt to get the cheese. So we notice in blue that we have an independent clause. That is one sentence. If we took away what was left after it, that sentence would still stand alone by itself. Same thing with our second part in green. If we were to get rid of the first part of the sentence, the mouse was equally as unlucky in his attempt to get the cheese can stand alone by itself as a sentence. So since we have two independent clauses here, we need to combine them with a comma and a conjunction. It is important to note that you cannot just combine these sentences with just a comma or just a conjunction. You need to have both of them there together in order to make a compound sentence. Otherwise, you run into creating a run-on sentence, which is something that we definitely don't want. So in our next example, we have the dog had watched all of this, but he had refused to become involved. So our part in blue there is our first independent clause. We've combined it with a comma and a conjunction, and we've added on our second independent clause, he had refused to become involved. So I would like you to take a second and look at these sentences and identify them as either being simple or compound. And I have the answers for you on the next slide, but please do take the time to go through it on your own. All right, so for the first sentence, you should have identified it as being a simple sentence. The car drove quickly down the road, expresses one complete thought. It is a one independent clause. In our next sentence, the dog chased the cat and then it chased the bird is a compound sentence. We are combining two clauses with a comma and a conjunction. Our third example, George Washington was a president. He was the first, is a compound sentence. We have two independent clauses and it is combined with a semicolon. And our last one, the rain caused a great amount of flooding in the streets, is a simple sentence. It is one independent clause, and it is only expressing one thought. Next type of sentence is a complex sentence. And when we have a complex sentence, we have a sentence that is made up of one independent clause and one dependent clause. So this kind of goes back to the idea that we talked about yesterday when we had to separate our clauses with commas in a sentence. So we need to remember that if a dependent clause begins a sentence, it must be followed by a comma. However, if we reverse it and our sentence starts with an independent clause, we do not need that comma to separate out our dependent clause. So our complex sentence contains an independent clause and a dependent clause. And we'll take a look at some examples on the next slide. So on this slide, we have two examples of complex sentences. So let's take a look at these two complex sentences that we have here. Our first one, after he gave it some thought, the mouse decided to wait until later for his trek. This sentence begins with a dependent clause, and it is highlighted in red. We know that after he gave it some thought, even though it has a subject and it has a verb, that it cannot stand alone by itself. So that is a dependent clause. Our next part of this in blue, the mouse decided to wait until later for his trek, is an independent clause. If we were to remove that part in red, we would be left with a complete sentence that could stand alone by itself. And we know that when we combine these two clauses together, that we are left with a complex sentence. In our first example here, our dependent clause is coming before our independent clause, so we need to separate them with a comma. So the last type of sentence that we are going to talk about is called a compound complex sentence. And in a compound complex sentence, you need to have at least two independent clauses and at least one dependent clause. So if we think about it, we first need to write a compound sentence in order to get that compound part of our compound complex sentence. And then once we have combined our two independent clauses together, what we are then doing is adding a dependent clause somewhere either before or after one of our independent clauses. And I will show you some examples on the slide. So we're going to take a look at both of these examples on this page so that we can really understand how to write a compound complex sentence. So first in our first example, I have color-coded our clauses for you. So in red, we will have our dependent clause. In green, we have our first independent clause. In white, we have our comma and our conjunction. And then in blue, we have our second independent clause. So our first sentence starts off with a dependent clause. So we have, even though it seems that the two are bent on the other's destruction, we need to put a comma because it is coming before an independent clause. The cat and the mouse were rather fond of one another. We need to put another comma followed by conjunction because we're adding on another independent clause. So neither wanted the other's defeat. So what the thing with compound complex sentences is you need to make sure that you have a dependent clause. You need to make sure that you have two independent clauses, and you also need to make sure that you are getting your punctuation in there correctly. So if you are starting your sentence with a dependent clause, always know that it needs to be followed by a comma. And then your independent clauses should always be combined with a comma and a conjunction. So our last example on there, we're kind of reversing the order. We're starting with our independent clause, and then we're adding our dependent clause on the end. So as this game was begun thousands of years ago, comma, and our conjunction, it will continue far into the future as other cats and mice revel in hide and seek. So here we have our dependent clause at the very end. All right, so on this slide you have 4 examples that I want you to go through and identify if they are a simple, compound, complex, or compound complex sentence. And I'd like for you to bring your answers back with you to class tomorrow.